Okay, uh, welcome to EECS 562. I am your TA, Brian Cordill. I'm recording this module to help you get jump started on the reports that are going to be a part of this lab. We have basically four things we need to go over today. We'll go over what I actually want in the reports themselves, but before we do that, um, we really write reports in sort of specific ways for different technical readers. So before we can jump into the actual report requirements, we'll actually talk a little bit about the actual readers and the different types of readers. Once we do that, we'll actually go through the various sections of the reports and what I want to see. And then we'll go over the sort of the top 5 mistakes that I see and that most students lose the bulk of their points on. So if you can avoid those 5 mistakes, you'll typically do very well. And then we'll also be using editing marks and doing some editing of our technical writing. So if you haven't seen those editor's marks before, I'll go over them briefly so you have an idea of what they are. Okay, so first up, knowing your readers. As far as objectives on this, we have 3 really objectives. You need to identify the 3 most common technical readers. Each of those are distinct, and they each have a slightly different attribute that we need to address. So we'll also want to be able to discuss the differences between the reading styles and sort of the expectations. Finally, we'll want to be able to identify the various elements that we'll need to put into our reports to satisfy the 3 different types of technical readers. Okay, so first, yes, technically I'm probably the only person that's actually going to read your reports, but that isn't really what I mean by know your reader. Like I was saying, we do very specific things in our reports to address sort of the different ways people go about reading technical material. And to really understand why we do that, we have to talk about these different readers. So I've kind of grouped them into 3 categories. There's a reader that will read your introduction, and then maybe they'll flip to a very specific part of your report, just read that one section that interests them, and that's it. They won't read the whole thing. There's another type of reader which will read your introduction. They might skim your plots, be interested in just skimming your results, and then they may read their conclusion if you've sort of sparked their interest. And then you'll actually have a type of reader that will actually sit down and read your report cover to cover, every single word. And the challenge we have when writing technical reports, both in this lab and when you get out into a professional environment, is being able to write for all 3 of these readers simultaneously. All right, so how can we actually do that? Well, we have to include specific elements in the correct places to satisfy each one of these readers. So before we jump into each one, let's take a quick moment to notice that each of those readers will read the introduction. And we really have to use that to our advantage. We have to make the introduction very high impact. It needs to convey a lot of information. So in this lab, and in general, it's a good idea to basically make your introduction a high-level summary of your experiment or of your report. Okay, so let's actually dive into the specific readers themselves. There is what I have dubbed the intro flipper. This type of reader is generally doing some sort of related work and wants to see, maybe how you did a specific part of your report. Maybe they are doing related work and they just want to see how you set up your experiment to see if you really did it the same way they did, or maybe there's you've got something new in that regard. After reading it, a reader should really have a good idea of the concepts that this report is exploring, have a rough idea of how we set up our experiments, and what we found and why this finding is interesting. To really let them do that, we have to write our introduction well. We have to do all the things we just talked about. But in addition to that high-level summary, we have to basically index our report for the reader, so that if they want to go and just read about the results, or they just want to go read about the test setup, they have sort of an idea of how to go about doing that. So in addition to the stuff we talked about, the high-level summary we just talked about for the intro, we're also going to add in a sentence that amounts to something like this. The underlying concepts examined in this report are laid out in the theory section. The test setup is presented in the methodology section. measurement data is in the results section, and interpretation of the data is in the discussion section. Just give them an idea of what sections of the reports do what. Now, I've basically dictated that you will have very obvious titles, you'll have methodology, you'll have results, you'll have discussion, you'll have theory, and those are kind of self-explanatory, but that's not always true. Once you get out of here, you can name, you can title your sections anything you want, but it's still good to put in this type of index so that people can find those sections easily. Okay, so that brings us to our second reader, one that I've called the plot skimmer. This reader is generally pressed for time. They might be reading a bunch of reports that are all very similar, and they really just want to know if there's something that stands out about this report. So they'll typically just read the introduction, and then they will flip to your results, and then they'll really just look at the graphs. And then maybe if your results are interesting, they may go back later and read it again. So since the only thing besides the introduction that they are reading is looking at the figures themselves, it's critically important that our figures and tables be labeled clearly and understandable to somebody that is just looking at them, that's not reading the rest of the reports for context. And in some ways, we need to make it so that our figures and tables make a stripped down version of the report. So that if you just gave somebody the introduction and the figures and tables with their captions, they could more or less figure out what is going on. And then the third type of reader is somebody I've dubbed the full reader. This person will sit down and read every single word in your report start to finish. They may go back and forth between sections. This reader typically does not have extensive knowledge of the subject area that you're discussing. Perhaps they're new to the area and they want to try to understand what's going on, or maybe they're trying to basically replicate your results, so they want to know every detail so that they can set up their experiment in the exact same way in hopes of reproducing your results. So for this type of reader, consistency and clarity is really important. If they go through and read every single word, and in one section, maybe you're using a certain terminology, but in a later section you've switched nomenclature, that can easily confuse and frustrate them. So it's very important to, basically have every single word be correct, consistent, and clear. That's sort of the three readers. And sort of the things we do to accommodate each one of them. So let's actually dive into how is the report structured and what do I want to see. Now, this is going to be a little bit high level and a little bit quick. I've got a detailed document available on the website, but we'll touch on each section here. So our objectives here are to name the 4 main body sections in your report, to explain what materials are discussed in each one of those sections, and how those sections get linked together in this report. And then we need to be able to identify different lab elements and their appropriate locations within the report. Your lab reports consist of 4 main sections plus an introduction and a conclusion. So the 4 main sections are theory, methodology, results, and discussion. And when you actually go and write your report, go ahead and have the title of each of those sections be those 4 things. When I sit and read your reports, I expect to see a section titled Introduction, Theory, Methodology, Results, Discussion, and Conclusion. If I don't find those sections, you'll start confusing me, and then you'll start losing points because I'm having trouble figuring out what you did in all the elements of the reports. So that's important. Okay, so let's look at the 4 main sections. So theory. Here is where you really discuss the underlying theory that we're examining in lab. As engineers, everything we do is built upon some model of the world or some engineering theory. Each of these labs are designed to illustrate different engineering theory and different engineering models. So it's important in the theory section that you discuss, the theory and models that we're looking at in the lab. As a simple rule of thumb, if you're using a formula in this lab somewhere, you need to have it in the theory section, and you need to discuss, what it means. Okay, methodology. This is really the how of the lab. How did you conduct the experiment? How was the lab set up? How was the equipment put together? How did you make a measurement? Things like that. So this section is always going to have a block diagram of your test setup. So in all of these labs, we will be connecting together various modules to build something, and then we will be hooking it to some test equipment to, demonstrate that what we've built is correct. So we need to have a block diagram showing how everything is connected together, and then how the test equipment is connected to the modules that we've built. And that is really your block diagram. We also need a description of the test equipment. This is things like, what frequencies was the spectrum analyzer set to. That way, if I built everything in the block diagram and hooked up the test equipment, I could set my equipment to be the exact same thing your equipment was set to, and then hopefully we could reproduce the exact same results. There's also needs to be sort of a high-level test procedure. And this you need to be careful with. There's a tendency for students the first time they write the report to give me a step-by-step test procedure. And I absolutely do not want that. At no point should you tell me what buttons you pressed to do something. That's too low level. Results section. The results is really the what of the lab. What did you measure? And this is really the raw measurements. If you apply a formula or something, or make some sort of calculation, save that result. That'll go in the discussion section. This is just where you put your raw measurements so that I can see, if there's a mistake somewhere in the report, I say, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. I can still see your raw measurements to see, oh, okay, maybe you made a calculation error and down the line something went wrong, but you hooked everything up right and, everything's right. But I have to have the raw measurements to be able to do that. So that's what the results section is. This section can actually be very terse. You will basically have a bunch of figures and tables, and then really for each one of those figures or tables, you need to have 2 to 3 sentences describing them. You can't just put, results section at the top of a page, 6 plots on the various measurements, and then move on to the next section. You have to discuss each and every one of those figures. And this is really just a description, so they have context. If you don't have this description, the figure is really out of place, it has no context, and really doesn't have a meaning. This section also has to be tied to the methodology. So in the methodology, you've laid out how the equipment is configured and what you're measuring. So this should basically flow right from that. You should be able to say something like, well, with the equipment set up as seen in the block diagram in the previous section, this measurement was made with an oscilloscope or made with a spectrum analyzer, and the result of that measurement can be seen in figure 2. That's the type of thing I'm looking for. The discussion section is really then the why of the report. Why do these results make sense? And this section really ties together the theory and the results section. So typically we will be making some sort of measurement, and then you'll have to apply some sort of formula or some sort of theory that you've talked about to come up with some sort of, okay, the module we built, or the system we built works. So I like to kind of say the theory plus results section equals the discussion section. This is also sort of your opportunity to talk about what went wrong. So at some point, you will put something together incorrectly, and you won't realize it, and maybe you'll get out. If you're lucky, I will come over, I will look at it and say, wait a minute, something's not right here, let's try this again. But there are 9 groups in a lab. Sometimes people will get through a measurement before I have a chance to look at it and tell them everything's okay. So if you sit down, start writing your report, and realize something's not right, the discussion section is where you can also tell me what went wrong. This is where you really sort of draw your measurements out. The results section, you just basically said, this is how I measured them, and this is the measurement I got. The discussion section is really what does that measurement mean? Okay, so that's the 4 main sections of your report. I highly recommend you write those 4 sections and then write the intro and conclusion, because in some ways the introduction and the conclusion are summaries of those 4 sections. Both the intro and the conclusion basically have a summary of those 4 main sections we just talked about, and then they tie that together with an objective of the lab. Each one of these labs, generally in the procedure, will actually have, very explicitly for you, an objective of the lab. And if it's not in the lab report, you will have to sit down and think about what the objective of the lab was. If it was to measure something or demonstrate something, you can use that to tie together basically the entire report. Okay, so let's work through a quick example and make up a laboratory experiment we might perform. And we'll put together the lab experiment and we'll discuss what information goes into which sections. Okay, so for this lab, let's say we want to measure the efficiency of solar cells. So if you're not familiar with solar cell technology, you generally have a stack of semiconductors. And we'll draw a picture of that. Maybe you've got 3 or 4 layers over some generally metal substrate. And each one of these layers reacts to a different wavelength of light and can absorb and convert a certain wavelength of light into electricity. And depending on how you arrange these stacks and how you dope the silicon, you can get various efficiencies. So it's important to measure it. So we want to somehow measure that efficiency. So let's see. How might we go about that? Well, we might need, let's say, a sheet, a rectangular sheet of solar cells of a known dimension. So here's our solar cells. And then let's say we know the dimensions. So we know its length and we know its width. So this would be its width, and then this dimension would be its length. All right, and then we'd have to essentially expose it to a light source and measure how much energy is generated. Now, these generally work outside with the sunlight, but unfortunately it's difficult to use the sun as a source for comparing efficiencies, so we'd have to use basically a lamp. But sunlight's also difficult to replicate color-wise, its makeup. So we actually have to probably use a couple of different lamps of different wavelengths and different efficiencies. So let me draw in a couple of lamps here. These are my miniature sun lamps. Let's do yellow. And then we'll do a red one as well. All right, so we have our 3 lamps. We expose them to our solar cell where we know the dimensions, and that's going to generate energy, and somehow we need to be able to measure that energy. So maybe we connect this whole system up to maybe a voltmeter. So we'll just draw simple plus minus voltmeter. All right, so if we were to do that, we'd get a measurement of energy, and we'd get some sort of plot maybe. So we'd have something like this. Let's make a bar graph maybe, where this axis is the amount of efficiency or the amount of energy, depending on how we wanted to measure it. Probably would actually be a voltage. So let's, instead of having E here, let's cross that out and say we'd actually have a voltage measurement, because that's what we actually said we would measure. If I can draw a B. And then we'd have basically a plot for each one of those lamps. So maybe the green bar, we have this much voltage measurements, the green lamp, or sorry, the yellow lamp, we have some other one. And the red lamp, we have a final measurement. Sort of like this. Okay, and then from there we would, from those voltage measurements, we could say, well, the sun is a certain combination of green, yellow, red lamps. If we add all of those together, we will get some final efficiency metric. If I can draw this, should look a little bit like an E. And that would be our lab. So those are our various elements. So the question now becomes, okay, where do those go in the report? Well, this discussion of the stacks of semiconductors and their arrangement, well, that goes in the efficiency, in the theory section. This diagram here is a very simple test setup, block diagram. So that would go in our methodology. These voltage measurements would be our raw data, so those go into our results. And then we've done some sort of calculations on these voltage measurements to get this efficiency. So that would go into our discussion, because our discussion fundamentally is our theory plus our results. We'd also have to discuss how do we go from these voltage measurements to this efficiency in the theory section. So there's another thing that would come up to theory, but I don't really have a good picture for it. Okay, so top 5 mistakes I spend most of my time correcting in reports. And this probably accounts for, I'm going to say, 60% of the points that students lose. So if we go through these now, hopefully you can avoid making these mistakes. Avoid personal pronouns. Technical writing is not a first-person narrative. At no point should you say, I hooked up the following modules, or we turned the spectrum analyzer to X frequency. Technical writing is not a narrative or a short story of what you did in lab. What it is in a description of a measurement of an experiment, of measured results, and then an interpretation of those results. You need to take yourself out of the report. Now, the easiest way to do that is to sort of write in the passive voice, or in the third-person voice. Okay, so let's look at some examples real quick. So this example on the left, which I've labeled bad, is what I often see in the first report or two. So we took 2 measurements using a spectrum analyzer. For measurement 1, we connected the spectrum analyzer to a signal generator and recorded the peak power. So it's bad because it's using the personal pronoun we. So I'll generally circle that and say, okay, avoid personal pronouns. The student will lose a few points. Lab 2 rolls around and they go, okay, I'll get clever. Anytime I have written we, I will just replace that with the author. And you'll get a paragraph that looks something like this, that says, the author took 2 measurements using the spectrum analyzer. For measurement 1, the author connected the spectrum analyzer to a signal generator and recorded the peak power. Okay, that's still not correct. Yes, the author, changing we to the author is moving it to closer to a third-person passive voice, but it's still a narrative of what the unnamed author did, and that's still not right. So, I'll circle that and I'll write avoid personal pronouns, and the student will come in and ask me, wait a minute, but that's not a personal pronoun. What do I need to do? And we'll sit down and we'll talk about it, and eventually, by the third report, we'll get something closer to this last example. That is, this lab was divided into 2 experiments. The first experiment used a spectrum analyzer to examine the peak of a signal supplied by an external signal generator. Okay, that's good. There's not a narrative of what an individual did, but it is a description of what the experiment is. The next common mistake I see is contractions. Uh, Contractions like it's, can't, couldn't, things like that. Very common in colloquial English, conversational English. There it's fine, but in formal writing, it's not appropriate. There's an example here on screen you can pause and look at, but I think it's fairly obvious how to fix a contraction. You literally can just change it's to it is, and can't to cannot, and couldn't to could not. All right, figures and tables. So we touched on this briefly when we talked about the different types of readers. That we need to have very descriptive labels that goes along with every figure and table. That's part of it. But there's also some formatting issues that we should look at. So these kind of rules of thumb are good. So you always want to center a table or figure in the middle of a page or column. That's good if you're just having a single one. If you have two figures, you can have them next to each other. That's fine. Very important, you need to number every figure and table, but you're actually going to use a separate counter for each one. So you can have a figure 1 and a table 1, and that's really how you refer to a figure in the text. So if this figure 1 is somewhere in the results section, in the results text somewhere, you will say, figure 1 plots some voltage for some time. Okay, and then give every figure and table a Unix caption that describes what's in the figure and table. This really goes back to that sort of skimmer that looks at just your figures and tables. And then also I mentioned this earlier, but every single figure must be referenced in the text somewhere. If it's not referenced in the text, it might as well not be in there. It doesn't have any context. The reader's not able to understand what it means. Okay, so here's a quick example. So here we've got some voltage for some time plot. And we can see figure 1 has a caption of VG. Who knows what VG actually stands for? We don't have the rest of the report. So that's one problem. And then sort of the other problem with the figure on the left is that it's really got no scale on it. So in the better example on the right, we expand the caption to say input gate voltage ripple. Okay, that actually tells us what the plot is. We can see the time and voltage axes are given a set of units, seconds, and volts, and they're actually divided with numbers so we know what is in the figure. Table example. This one's very similar. So we see a bad table where there's really no formatting. It's very kind of difficult to read, and we see the table titles actually on the bottom. I guess this isn't mentioned in the earlier slide, but figure captions go below a figure, like we saw in the previous slide. Table captions go before. They're actually table titles, go before a table. So if we look at the better example, we see, I've added lines, so it's clear that, we're looking at VG and VD. We don't know what that is, but we know that's what's on the table, and we're plotting that first time. And we've expanded our table title to be input-output voltages as a function of time. So the next major thing I see people lose points on is basically how do they use equations. I'll tell you now, go ahead and get comfortable using equation editor in Microsoft Office. It's really the best way to put together equations. Like a figure and table, every equation needs to be numbered. That way we can reference that equation in the text somewhere. We also need to be very careful defining every symbol we use in an equation. In different communities, different symbols have different meanings, so it's best to just always define every symbol. So let's look at two examples. So in a bad example, we've got a short section of paragraph, and then the equation itself. I say a cosine signal has a frequency domain expression, and then you can see that I've written out a Fourier transform. But here I haven't numbered anything. We don't actually know if omega and omega naught, what they mean. So a better way to write this would say the Fourier transform of a continuous cosine waveform can be written. And then I've written out the equation. I've numbered equation 1. In general, you'll write your equation, and then aligned with the right-hand side of the page, you'll put your number continuing that sentence, where omega naught is the carrier frequency. Okay, so the last sort of thing I see people miss points on is acronyms. Science, engineering, there is a 3-letter acronym for everything. It sort of saves time and space in writing, but if you're not really familiar with the material, it can be a hindrance, especially if somebody doesn't define what that acronym stands for. So it's very important that the first time you use an acronym, you actually spell out or write out what the words to that acronym are, and then define it so people know what you're talking about. So, bad example, the VPP of a TTL circuit is exactly 5 volts for experiment 2. This is different than experiment 1, where VPP was set to 7 volts. If you don't know what VPP and TTL mean, then it's really hard for you to interpret those sentences. It's almost Greek. So to correct that, we basically put in the definitions for those acronyms. So the first time we use VPP, we say the peak-to-peak voltage, in parentheses, VPP, of a transistor logic circuit is exactly 5 volts for experiment 2. Now we know what those acronyms mean, so that when we reuse them in the next sentence, it's all is well and good. We don't have to redefine them. So we will be going through an editing process with these reports. So it's important to know a little bit about editing marks and what they mean. So I have a copy of this on the website, but very briefly, let me go over the most common ones that'll get used. That's really sort of this capitalize 3 underlining marks to capitalize a letter. A deletion is basically a line with a curly Q through something. Insertion is just a caret with whatever it needs to be inserted added in. And then lowercase is just a slash through something. Those are the 4 most common editing marks I'll use. I'll also sometimes just bracket a sentence and then write something to you and like, this sentence doesn't make sense. Or check this sentence for spelling. But when you get a chance to sit down and read this, this is available on the website when it becomes important.